TopMedTalk.
This is TopMedTalk, the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. The EBPOM World Congress is taking place this year between the 7th and the 9th of July at the British Library in London. Check out ebpom.org now.
Well, hello, welcome to TopMedTalk. I'm Andy Cumpstey and I'm your host here at the American Society of Anesthesiologists annual scientific meeting in the beautiful San Antonio. And I'm joined by my fantastic co-host, Kate Leslie.
Hi, Andy.
Great to be here again, isn't it?
It is. We're in the exhibit hall. It's still full of people looking at all the new technology. It's fantastic.
And it's the final day of what's been a very busy meeting, and it's one of our final podcasts, which is feeling a bit sad in a way.
It's very sad.
But to cheer us up, we're really lucky that it's a fantastic guest. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Adrian Gelb, who's been invited by the ASA to deliver the Ellison Pierce Lecture here at this year's meeting.
Hi, it's great to be here. Great to see you again, Kate, and to meet you, Andy.
Fantastic. So can you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself?
I'm an anesthesiologist. I grew up in Cape Town, South Africa, did my medical school training there. Then I did my internship worked in a mission hospital for a short period of time, which clearly had a lasting influence on me. And it was a wonderful experience. It wasn't long lasting. I did a little surgical rotation, and learned one of the many lessons in my life, what I had no aptitude for, and that was surgery, the petty point of suture. But I loved the acute care and the operating room environment and the ICU. I was really taken with the fact that anesthesiologists ran the ICU. And I also liked the idea that anesthesiologists, after a night on call, got the day off, unlike the surgical rotation I was doing. And so we headed off, like many of my peer group, out of South Africa, went to England, where I started doing anesthetics. And the National Health Service, as is its custom, was in total disarray and general unhappiness. And when we left South Africa, we actually planned to go to Canada. That's where we wanted to go to. We didn't want to be Americans, but we wanted the proximity. And so signed up for a residency in Canada, graduated from the University of Toronto, and did a research fellowship. I wanted to be at least a pseudo-academic, if not a real academic, and did a 1-year respiratory lung mechanics research fellowship. As a resident, I'd done a couple of research projects related to control of breathing. The lung mechanics fellowship was fascinating. But I learned again one of the things that I have no aptitude for, and that is physics. And so I'd land up at these meetings with engineers talking about gas flow and fluid dynamics. And I loved the concepts. I think I'm quite a good conceptual thinker. But the actual mechanics of how these gases were flowing and why you divided by cube roots and square roots in calculations, totally beyond me. And anyway, I went back to the job I had in Canada, half my time running in ICU, half the time in theater. And it turned out the hospital where I was at that time was the world's busiest cerebral aneurysm center. And I found myself very quickly instructed by the department head to do neuroanesthesia. And I said, no, I have no interest in being in a dark room with slightly odd surgeons looking down a microscope where I can't see what exactly they are doing. And he said, well, you think about it and come back. We'll meet again in a week. And I said, okay, I'll think about it. And so I came back a week later to the chair's department, and I said, thank you for the offer. I've thought about it very carefully, discussed it with colleagues, and I definitely don't want to do neuroanesthesia. And he said, he was a German refugee. He said, yeah. He did a lot of yeahs as I spoke. And he said, yeah, you think some more. And when the operating room schedule came out for Monday, there I was doing 2 craniotomies for aneurysms, and again on Wednesday and on Thursday. And I eventually acquiesced. I was grumpy and unhappy, but was actually started being taken with what was being done. And I guess it's part of my character that if you're stuck somewhere and you've got to do it, you may as well find interesting areas. And so I started showing an interest in what they were doing, and I made an effort to actually go to as many of the autopsies on patients that I'd looked after either in the operating theater or in the ICU. And this really seemed to stun the neurosurgeons. Here was an anesthesiologist who was actually interested in the outcomes of the patients. And so I kind of got engaged in how they clip aneurysms and like to look down the microscope. Charlie Drake, who was the world famous aneurysm clipper, used to periodically ask me for my opinion on the operating room. It was kind of fun and added to my enthusiasm for neuro and what we can do to help. And so he would say, Adrian, what do you think I should do? A little grumpy sort of voice. And I'd say, well, sir, why don't we go to the angiogram and review them together? And we'd go and have a look. And he'd have 2 rows of Japanese neurosurgeons or other visitors from Australia or wherever, with suddenly dilated pupils in horror that the great professor is asking his anesthesiologist for advice. And we'd look at the angiogram, and I'd say, well, what do you see as the problem? And he'd say, well, this angle and that angle. And then he would say to me, after we'd looked at it and I'd asked him a few leading questions in my naivety, he'd say, what do you think? And I'd say, well, I'd probably put a 7mm curved Heifetz clip on there. and he would say, 7mm curved Heifetz. Give me a straight Sagita, 9mm. But it really got me engaged in what was going on in the operating room and prompted me to think about, how the hell do I help these guys? What can we do in anesthesia that would make the surgery better? And
I think it's also a good message for our listeners, particularly our younger ones, that if you have to know what's going on in the operation to be a good anesthesiologist.
And I'm appalled at how little interest most of our colleagues or our trainees have. And on the other hand, how excited they would get every once in a while when in a dark aneurysm clipping room, I would just say to the surgeon, do you think you can just hang on a moment while my resident comes to look down the microscope so you can show them the anatomy and what you're going to do? And it really does look different down a microscope or down. And I went through quite a long phase as an educator of always trying to offer our residents the opportunity to scrub in for a few minutes at the crucial point of a surgical procedure, particularly those procedures where I find it hard to conceptualize what exactly is happening down this keyhole in the spinal cord. And so, it is really crucial.
Yeah, I think it's also was, probably a great sort of segue actually to from your work as an expert clinician and researcher in that area to how did that experience that you were having get you to move into your work with the WFSA? Those safety aspects, the equity issues. Where did that all begin?
So two parallel things took place there. One, as a teenager, probably a spin-off from my mother's frustrated interest in traveling, I grew interested in travel, geography, the world around us. And part of my sort of teenage, young adult aspiration was I would like to travel, meet people, and learn. And when I joined the faculty in London, Ontario, the then chair, Wolf Spurrell, had a similar interest. He was a keen traveler. He'd been part of the first Western medical visit to China in 1972. There was a group of anesthesiologists who went. And so when I joined the faculty, there was a Chinese anesthesiologist working there. And I enjoyed working with him, asking him questions. And sort of out of that, and there were Indian folks, Eastern Europeans who had come through the department. And so I enjoyed the interaction. And when I became chair of that department, continued that heritage. So I actually set aside money in our annual budget, not a lot, $1,000, $2,000, to sponsor people from low resource settings. And so that grew this kind of network of interest and the opportunity, more often than not, to go to their departments, give some lectures, do some teaching. And so that created that kind of global interest. The WFSA, I knew really through the World Congresses, which is probably the way most people know WFSA. And I'd participated in everyone, actually, since 1988, which I enjoyed, again, that opportunity to meet people from different parts of the world whose practices are different, whose way of thinking about clinical issues is different. But my perception of the WFSA is these were just old fogies who wanted to teach in interesting countries. And I slowly got drawn in through knowing Angela Enright initially, and
a legendary Canadian anesthesiologist and former president.
Exactly. Yes. And so, that kind of interaction drew my interest. And the person who really got me engaged is Alan Merry.
Yes.
And Alan sat me down, actually at an ASA meeting, somewhere in the bowels of one of the conference hotels, and asked me if I would be interested in being on his patient safety committee. And I said, yes, I'd be interested, provided it gave he and I an opportunity to make changes to the organization and some aspects of its outreach. And he said, yes, that's on his agenda. That's what he's been working at. And so I said, sure, sign me up onto the committee. And then from there, I took over from Alan as the chair of the committee, and then progressed onto the board and beyond.
And became the president. And you've got to watch out when you get onto organizations at the bottom, because before you know it, you're at the top.
Well, I don't think I have to worry about that for a long time.
Well, there is a key little step. There are two steps there. One is you put up your hand and you say, I'm willing to be involved. But what really moves you ahead, and I think it was Woody Allen who said, 80-90% of success is just showing up. But what moves one ahead is that what you do with that extra 10%. And you actually need to do something. Simply saying, I want to be on a committee gets you maybe half a bonus point. But being on the committee and actually doing something while you're on the committee gets you that other 9.5 points. And I'm one of those suckers. If I'm going to be on this committee, damn it, I'm going to do something. And it can be something that somebody else has initiated, or, gee, I have an idea myself. I'll pursue it and see how it works out.
So you were one of the leaders of the standards, weren't you?
Yes.
For the WFSA, really a landmark piece of work. Tell us about how that came about and what the highlights of the standards are, because you mentioned them in your Ellison Pierce lecture.
So again, I give Alan credit, Alan Merry, And John Eichhorn, way back in 1992, had done a set of WFSA recommendations or standards. And John, along with Jeff Cooper and others, had actually been part of the APSF founding group, which Ellison Pierce was the ASA president at the time, sponsored the creation of APSF as a foundation within ASA. There was that linkage. And so John Eichhorn, Alan Mary reactivated this 1992 document around about 2008 or so, and redid it and updated it. And although the document itself is very good, I'd have to say it is dry reading. It is really dry reading.
Unless you're a standards junkie,
Exactly. So when I took on the role as chair of the safety committee, Alan and I had agreed that standards should be updated at regular intervals. And so as chair of the standards committee for WFSA, I thought, well, that'll be one of the things I'll do. And if nothing else, I'd make it more accessible and readable. In parallel with that, the WFSA is a non-state actor, has official status at WHO, and has had for quite a long time. And WFSA wanted some volunteers to do that, and both Janneke Mellon-Olsen, who sadly died within the last year, but Janneke and I both put up our hands and said we'd be happy to see what we could do with WHO. And I found I actually enjoyed the interaction. It's a cumbersome bureaucracy, but I actually believe in the entity and its ability to do things. And so whenever I was at a conference in Europe, I'd go to Geneva before, afterwards, and network. And, I like to schmooze as much as you do, Kate. And so I'd, network around WHO with the surgery, anesthesia, emergency department, the patient safety group, the medicines group. And so when we started doing these standards, it seemed just natural. Let's see if we can get WHO engaged. And at the time, the individual who was in charge of the clinical service unit, which included anesthesia and surgery, happened to be a neurosurgeon. So we had a lot in common, and that personal interaction, I think, was crucial for the WHO engagement. And this is not a new insight, but personal relationships really drive the opportunity for change. Documents, national agreements are as much based on whether the two presidents of countries get on or don't get on. And so that created the opportunity to work with WHO on revamping them, revisualizing them, which I think was their greatest strength, that we've laid it out very simply. And the concept that was used was that standards should be structured in an additive fashion and needed to be linked to where they are going to be used. And so we used the construct that WHO had at that time of sort of freestanding clinics that would do sort of low-level safe surgery, hernias, hydroceles, lumps and bumps. And then there were district hospitals that could do cesarean sections, long bone fractures, laparotomies, and then there were tertiary care facilities that did neurocardiac. And so we constructed these standards on what is the rock bottom minimum. And the whole concept of the WHO, WFSA international standards was that they were a minimum and that countries should practice higher than that. So people in high-income countries like Australia, the US, or Canada, would say, but our standards are much more than that. And so they should be. All we set about doing is saying standards should not be lower than this. They should always be higher. And then we structured it as what's the absolute minimum for giving an anesthetic. You need to monitor respiration in some fashion, and it can be as simple as just counting respiration. You need to monitor oxygenation, so you must have a pulse oximeter. You need to monitor heart rate. You need to monitor blood pressure. So the rock bottom is very simple.
And I think the wording is often different in standards than guidelines. So it would say something like, giving oxygen is an important part of anesthesia. It doesn't say you must give oxygen or something. Isn't that the case with standards?
So there's a lot of confusion about the difference between policy, standards, and guidelines.
Yes. I'm clearly confused.
Policies are kind of high-level statements. Politicians like to do policies. They have a press announcement that too many people die from road accidents, and we're going to put a stop to that because they're dying in the emergency department, and so we're going to have a policy on how they should be resuscitated. That's a policy. That politician, be it within a National Anesthesia Society or other, would then appoint a committee to look at what to do. A guidelines committee would be obliged to look at the literature and grade the evidence and say the guidelines say you should use plasma light or Ringer's lactate in preference to saline or whatever. Standards and guidelines are not usually legally binding. So they're very clear statements and analyses of the literature, but the clinician still has the flexibility to argue, I didn't do that because. Standards in general are legally binding, but they come from consensus documents. So a consensus group would be put together, ideally representative, in the case of our international standards, all geographic regions, gender balanced, and covering all of the World Bank income regions. And then you look at what the guidelines say, you discuss what do we think is practical and reasonable, and then you set a standard. And standards, just like guidelines, should be updated periodically, but they have a different construct. One is essentially a consensus document. The other one is, here's what the current evidence says.
I would have been confused with Kate on the difference between the policy, standards, and
It's
guidelines.
great to have it
But
explained.
It's obviously really nicely explained and really clearly explained. But for the
I have a very simple mind.
for clinicians on the other end of these policy, standards, and guidelines, which should they go to, and why? If they're all out there, is there a should we be using the guidelines or this? Because they don't always agree.
Correct. They don't always agree because one's a consensus process, the other one is a research construct, in a sense. Which should one go to? One's usually legally bound by standards. There are actually fewer standards around than people realize. So if one goes to the ASA website, for example, I think they only have about 5 standards that are standards. And so there's this kind of gradation. There's standards. Then there are a whole lot of guidelines, which basically says, here's what the literature says at this time point. Then there are recommendations, which again are consensus activities, but of lesser oomph than the standards. And then they, kind of get more and more wishy-washy. They're now down to guidance, which isn't a guideline or a recommendation. What I do want to put in a plea for in that regard is the people who write those documents, be they recommendations or standards, should also consider the implications of actually operationalizing the standards or the recommendations. And so I would like to see all of those documents include some kind of discussion of barriers and facilitators, some discussion on why people may not do this, or have difficulty doing this, and here are ways in which you can do it. As I've already mentioned, I like the idea of a kind of additive concept. So in writing standards and recommendations, the group could think about, is there a sequence in which they should be implemented? Do this first because it's simplest. It'll get you some credibility. Do this next because to do this, you needed the first step. And I think one of the ways we fall down in implementing our recommendations and standards is there's an attempt to implement everything. There are these 6 things you should be doing if you're putting in spinals, epidurals, or whatever you're doing. And I'd like to see those documents have this, do this, then that, then that, then that.
What should people be looking out for on the horizon of what's coming up in the future that the group's going to be working on soon?
Well, everybody and their mother these days is talking about AI. So that, without a doubt, is going to flood our literature with some good stuff and some bad stuff, and some stuff that will lead us astray. But clearly, the ability of technology in general, to lead us, it has been an integral part of our advancement in patient safety and will continue to do that. But clearly, AI technology will take us an order of magnitude further ahead, not just in our clinical decision making, but also in documenting what exactly we do, which touches on this morning's Rovenstein lecture on the importance of data and feedback. So I'm excited about the possibility and the future, and interested to watch and dabble in how we bring this to fruition for the benefit of patients. And if we do things for the benefit of patients in systems that are geared to working appropriately for the benefit of patients and ourselves, I think we'll be much happier in our jobs, much happier with what AI tells us we should be doing as we evaluate it. And I think patients will have a way better outcome. So I'm optimistic.
Thank you for a fantastic lecture yesterday. And thank you for being here at the ASA. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Andy.
As always, thank you for listening. You can hear this podcast and all our others on our website on topmedtalk.com. You can find us on your podcaster of choice. We're on all the main social media channels. Please do give us a like, a thumbs up. It makes a difference to us. As always, a huge thank you to our fantastic sponsors that keep us free and open access around the world. That's BD and GE. And thank you all very much for joining us here in San Antonio at the ASA. Huge thank you to the ASA again for supporting us at this wonderful meeting.
TopMedTalk.
TopMedTalk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, evidence-based perioperative medicine. Join clinicians from around the world at EBPOM World Congress 2026 between the 7th and the 9th of July at the British Library in London. 3 days of evidence-based perioperative medicine, global insights and expert debate, featuring speakers including Michael Marmot and Ken Rockwood. Go now to edpom.org. That's edpom.org.